You're listening to Pathways and Means, a podcast that inspires and shows people how to tap into their creative spirit. We sit down with leaders and makers in every industry to talk about their process, what inspires them, and about how to build incredible things with the power of creativity. The future belongs to the creators, so come join us. This is Pathways and Means. Hakim, Hazim, welcome to the podcast, man. Glad you can be here.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
Man, it's such an honor. We've got two Hazims in the room today. So if I'm not mistaken, you're SJ's older brother, right?
That's right, and I also have to clarify something. I am the original Big Z.
We're getting the crosses in the corner, y'all. Let it be said. It's on the record. Well, we're so glad that you're here, the original. And like a lot of things original, sometimes it's really good to hear about some of the stories that help shape us. And even for our company, Creative Pathways and Means, right? There's a couple of really original pieces of thought. And if I'm not mistaken, your story with I guess we're going to call him Lil Zim for the for the podcast, but there's this concept, the creativity model, which is increasingly starting to spread and shape the way that some people are thinking about creativity. And some years back, you and SJ were having a conversation that really was sort of the genesis of this idea. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit into your perspective on that and what that was like.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I want to say I try to track with the years. I think it's around 2015. Somewhere in that time. I may be off a year or so. And SJ's always been doing a lot of stuff and very passionate about the community and the work and things he was doing. And we were just in his basement sketching some things out. And we all know how talented SJ is. And sometimes you have so much talent, you can do so many different things. So I thought it was important for him to have a platform that could actually cover many of his talents and abilities. And creativity was something that he always was able to just, you've seen him how he can just off the top of the dome do different things and see things other people don't. So there's a wittiness, there's a skill, there's an artistic thing to it. And so one of the things I've always been able to do is kind of come up with names or different things or models to help people remember and think about things. So in the discussion that we had, this is kind of what came up, Creative Pathways and Means, and actually looking at how many times he's been able to overcome things or navigate things even when a path didn't exist. So I really just kind of said, okay, let's make a business based on your life. Right. Let's look at what you do and look at how you can teach that to other people, inspire other people to do that. And that's where the name came from, Creative Pathways and Means. And then everything else was, was up to him. And one of the things that was interesting, I told him, I said, well, if I really invest in something, I've never invested time or energy in a company that's not nationally recognized. And he'd already had some of that, recognition. And then, computer drugs came out and the rest, so to speak, is history. And I actually got to, I think we launched the model, I think it was 2017, he came down to Idaho, what he would say is Ida Pimp, but came down to Idaho.
Boise.
And he actually got to present to some probation officers, judges, and chief of police, and he was one of the speakers. And his presentation went over really well. And we knew at that time that something was birthed and born. And that was, I think, a catalytic event for him, because I saw at that point really how he really started to look at the business model, pull back from some of the volunteering stuff, which is fine, volunteering help, but you still need to eat, you know? And so I've seen nothing but great momentum, and I think Topeka gets the benefit from time he spent in the basement, just kind of figured out, okay, I know that I not only have this value, but I want to share this with others. And so his platform was there, and then the model, he already had the model down, the creativity model, and then we tweaked some definitions and different things, but the rest is history. And it's just been a fun ride for me. You know, it's just been fun. You know, who doesn't have fun talking to SJ? So,
amen.
It's interesting.
No, I love that phrase that, you know, y'all punched forward really strong. Where a path doesn't exist, create one. And I see that happening not only in our business, but in all sorts of different businesses, and especially in a time like the past 18 months where things have really not been clear or easy for anyone. And it seems almost like there's been a couple of different camps where someone can either take part in the Great Resignation, where they're going to give up because there aren't really clear paths forward, or they'll be the sort of person that's going to forge forward and make a path. And I see in both your and SJ's story this willingness to look at the world in a creative way, to find those patterns and to be able to model them in useful ways, and then be able to connect that to a larger audience. And when you're talking about Idaho and this space that SJ was able to come into, it sounds like at that point you had already started to build a little bit of an audience of your own. And I don't want to say a little bit. You and your company, Relevant Now, are doing all sorts of work in some different industries. And I wondered if you could maybe share a little bit about what you got going on.
Okay, yeah. Relevant Now conceptually started just conceptually, and this is sometimes how long it takes. Way back in the early 90s, I had a conversation with my older brother, who was he's a retired detective now, and I wanted to get into the space of law enforcement, but I wasn't good at taking orders. And I know that about my personality. And he said, you know, you still need to get some experience. So, you know, I went and did corrections and different things. But going back to that, we were seeing a lot of things happening. You know, you saw the Olympic bomber, you saw Waco, and I developed a really keen interest in what we call in the field violent non-state actors. So basically groups that are actively trying to overthrow the government or challenge it, things like that. So before you had like traditional terrorism, and then after that you had domestic terrorism, and then, you know, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. And at that point, I knew that was something I wanted to study. So, you know, I was, at the time, I went back to Washburn, finished up my degree in that, and then went and got my master's in national security. And I was studying to actually go and work in the government, for the government. And then after 9/11 happened, I'd already finished a project with the National Corrections and Technology Center West, which was funded by the National Institute of Justice, on Al-Qaeda. And we finished the practice dry run, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Bunker, who's a colleague and friend of mine. We finished that draft in August 28th. And then 9/11 happened. And so all of this stuff that we had been studying now made me a national expert overnight. And that was back in 2001. So I was 34 years old at the time. And so, again, started studying at 92. 2001, all of the study and all of the work now had value, and I was able to actively contribute early on, before there was a Homeland Security, educate people in the field about some of those threats. And I got to do it as a consultant. So for me, you know, that's when my business started. And I looked at what my brother had told me. He says, you need some law enforcement experience, but you don't need it to be too heavy. So I know I needed a degree that would give me some significant gravitas, credibility, to be able to speak to those people. And so that's how I kind of created my path. And it's been interesting because I've worked with law enforcement, I worked with offenders, I've worked with places that are global, and all of it kind of comes down to these non-state violent actors and their proliferation in the world. And but I also have a heart of compassion, and I think the criminal justice system needs a lot of reform. So I've also worked in that, and I've also volunteered in that. So I've married basically the full spectrum of security in terms of how do I help the practitioners, but also in some cases, how do you help the offenders? So I've been able to come up with a business that keeps me really busy, where I can deal with judges, I can deal with people in the armed forces, intelligence agencies, but also I can help people who are in our society who haven't had the advantages some of us had, and help transition them into a society where they can reap some of the benefits from it. And I look at all of that as part of a compassionate approach to helping people, but also challenging the status quo and the powers that be.
No, that's incredible, and amazing how 10,000 hours of work pays off, and then 2 weeks later you become an overnight success, right? I feel like in some of the waters that you swam in particular, there's this a lot of how, whether it's LEOs or terrorist cells, I feel like a lot of the action and energy behind the ways that they act and interface with one another has to do with the narrative that they end up telling themselves. And a lot of that's grounded in reality, but some of it's just grounded in culture or in stories that we've been told. And there's this amazing power, not necessarily good, bad, or indifferent. It's what we make it. But the power of the narrative to shape an outcome, whether you're a police officer that's out in the field and you're looking to meet somebody with compassion, or you're looking for some derelict criminal to catch to keep the streets safe, or if you're somebody that's looking to get to the States, or if you're looking to destroy it. A lot of that's shaped by the power of the narrative. And I know that this concept of the narrative is one that's been important to you and that you've spoken into. And so I'm curious your perspective on how important that is for the way that we shape our lives, professionally, creatively, and how that's affected your life too.
Well, what's interesting, you look at the creativity model, and it starts with inspiration, and then it leads to motivation, and then to actually creation, and then to connection, right? So if you look at a story, it has all of those elements, right? So if you're looking for a way to really connect with people, stories are, whether they're true or not, as you alluded to, Connor, are very powerful because they capture you, right? And sometimes, sadly, even in political circles, people grieve not necessarily because there's been real calamity or loss of life, but because their narrative wasn't good enough to capture the audience. Am I getting too hard now?
No, that's killer.
And so for me, I became very interested in the power of stories. Used to read quite a bit, and what's interesting to me, the first thing I talked about of a story was the Rocky movies, particularly Rocky III. Rocky III, that story, and I owe Sylvester Stallone, I owe Sly a lot, because it's the first time I got serious about working out, right? The story of Rocky and overcoming the odds over and over again, creating a path when none existed. And for me, I started to look at my own self, and I'm like, am I a Rocky, right? Am I a Rocky? And I think, in 8th grade, I played basketball. I spent a lot of time on the bench. And then in 9th grade, I was pretty good. And then my dad benched me because I got a couple D's. He pulled me off the team. sophomore year, things started to click. And by the time I, got to be a junior or senior, I actually earned scholarships and eventually got a D1 scholarship after going to junior college. But the story at that time for me was Hakim's a street baller. He's not a team player. He hasn't played the game long enough. And I heard all of those things. And I decided to create my own story. And from the confidence I got from athletics, now I parlayed that into academics. Now I parlayed that into business. And what I see of just my own experience, all around the world, you have roughly 2/3 of the world lives in abject poverty, where there's no opportunities.
$2 a day.
Yeah. So who's holding us down? So there's so much power in that narrative because we do not understand how a 15-year-old can blow himself up, right, for a cause, but we've never been in their shoes. We don't understand how in Russia, back in the early 2000s and 90s, they had something called Black Widows. So these Chechnyan widows who lost their family members or husbands, they became suicide bombers. And there's a story of desperation, but there's also a story of triumph. So from the perspective of those people who are outside of power and full participation, we see a suicide bombing and terror and death. We see it as a desperate act. They see it as a story of liberation.
Right.
The same exact event, two narratives. Okay, the folks that are down and out, those people become martyrs. Our narrative is these people are terrorists and they're evil and they're violent and they're wicked. And so you have to start looking at that when you start trying to understand things. And from my background in sociology, I've really learned to look at the stories of people in groups. I work with a lot of gang kids, right? And every gang has its own narrative about how it came into existence. Most of the black gangs that started out as social clubs. They didn't start out as gangs. You go over into cartels, right? A lot of those cartels started out as vigilantes trying to avenge wrongs that have been done to them. So the stories in my field are very powerful, change lives, cost lives, right? But it still fits into that creativity model that you guys have been espousing and talking about, and people connect to that. And so one of the things that we do in looking at countering violent extremism is we come up with something called counter narratives. And so the Homeland Security, FBI, and different universities partnering with them, spending many hours trying to come up with counter narratives to extremism stories.
Oh my God. Yeah, they say you want to take over a country, the first thing you do is take over the media. And I think in part of that is because they help control the story, control the narrative.
Yeah.
And just amazing what, goodness. So Tony Robbins, he talks about how there's 3 really important perspectives that you can take on. The first one's what you focus on, because what you focus on is going to grow. 2 is what meaning you assign to it. Right? Because you can focus on the same thing, the same event, and ascribe a completely different meaning or narrative. And the third is what you're going to do about it. And it almost always goes in that order. So it's amazing how the meaning around some of the death that's happening, whether it's overseas or otherwise, a suicide bomber and a soldier, one uses a bullet and the other one uses a bomb, might both feel that their causes are equally worthy because of the meaning that they've ascribed to their side, and either side, I think we've seen it. We've seen U.S. military men that have defected and gone over to, say, a cell like ISIS, and we've seen plenty of people that have become sympathetic to, Western ways of living. And it's just amazing the magical power, and not magic in a positive or negative way, but just the transformative and almost mystical sense that can happen when you change the narrative and the meaning.
Yeah.
So there's something that you've coined, this process of envisioning, right? Because sometimes our stories and our internal capacities to be able to affect change is limited by our biography, by our direct experience. And sometimes I think you've posited that there are ways for us to maybe grow beyond those current limits so that we can build those internal capacities and maybe make life look like something that doesn't fit our literal story just yet. Yeah. So what's that like?
So one of the things I came up with, and we'll go back and look at this and see how it makes sense. So I came up with something called the 7 E's. And it's like 7 steps to empowerment, right? Everyone's born in a particular environment. And from their environment, they have certain experiences. And based on those experiences, they start to set expectations. So that's like a decision wheel. Your decision wheel revolves around your environment, experiences, and then your expectations that are formed. The only way out of that initially is the envisioning process. You have to start to see something different for yourself. And then you have to be able to sustain that. But that also ties into the creativity model again. Because imagine in envisioning, right? You got to be inspired by something. You got to be motivated by something. And then hopefully you start to create a different path for yourself. And then if you do achieve, now people are going to connect with that and say, hey, maybe I can do it also. So when you're looking at envisioning, that's that 4th piece. Now, the next part is, so the first one I call, just to remember it, I call it the decision wheel. The next one I call the appeal. So envisioning is the appeal. So it all kind of rhymes so you can remember. The last part of the 7 E's is the hill. So the hill is, now you have to educate yourself. So it's education. And then you have to exercise endurance before you ever get to empowerment. So there's all these different steps. And if you start to look at your life, Ryan's life, and the things you've overcome, all those things are there, right? You know, where I heard you talk about I'm terrible, you know. I'll never forget that.
When I get shooters out here, Hakim.
But you know, the story of your parents they were creating their own narrative, and they weren't going to be limited by their environment. You know, some people will tell you environment is everything. I beg to differ, you know, because I've experienced it, and my father's a great example of that kind of change. So when you start to look at all of those different things, the 7 E's kind of starts to, mouth getting dry here. The 7 E's starts to point to a way out and to a pathway for us, because now you start to see not only what it takes, but how it can be duplicated. Because people who fall short in any of those steps don't really ever reach the empowerment stage. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of how I look at that, and that's kind of how I put that in a framework that I can remember and ask myself. Like, I might say, you know what, Hakim, today, man, you really suck on the endurance piece. You just don't have it. you know, you don't want to get up that hill. Or sometimes I may be stuck in my decision wheel based on my environment, experiences, and expectations. So I think all of those things, and I hope that kind of answers the question, but I look at it kind of through those lenses. Like, how am I going to get to empowerment? How am I going to be able to help other people see that?
Right. I like this concept of envisioning as almost the E that can break you out of that cycle.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned that some people think that environment is everything. Mm-hmm. I think that it's a heavy influence, but I also think that part of the power of envisioning is that you can literally, at a biological level, you can start to condition your brain for an environment that you haven't physically been in yet. So there have been people like Steph Curry or otherwise that have talked about how important it is, like their free throw game will get better just by them spending an hour a day going through the mental exercise of sinking the buckets.
Yep.
And how there's been study after study that's shown that this process of envisioning can help almost as much as literally ended up on the court, because you're still building that preparedness inside your brain and inside your heart before you ever have a chance to do it. So environment in a physical world sense may not be everything, but your bodily reaction and your framework of what's possible in the world based off of both your physical and your mental environment, you know, I think that there's some real truth to that. You might not always be in a place where you can do something about your physical environment, but your mental environment, you've always got the ability to condition it. And that concept of envisioning, man, that's a powerful way to do it.
That's actually what I call the mentoring program I work with for at-risk youth. It's called the Envision Mentoring. There's another program for gang kids called the 4 C's, which is character plus competence plus critical thinking equal credibility. Like you have to have there's certain pieces in your life. And who doesn't envision being empowered? I don't know anyone who doesn't. And so there has to be an end game even to what you're envisioning, right? Because even if you take an extremist, you know, or terrorist, they're still trying to be empowered. There's still an aim there, and the stories to empowerment. And I think that, you know, the thing about envisioning that I think is so helpful is that you start to rule out things in your mind that don't line up with what you've envisioned. Someone can come to you with a great offer. Oh man, this is, you know what, and you're just, it doesn't fit into your box. And, you know, I've been, you know, offered things to go work for people and make, you know, a lot of money, more than I make in just running my business, right? But I would be less empowered. And so that doesn't appeal to me. And so I just rule it out. And then once you start envisioning and creating your own path, it actually helps you. And I tell kids all the time, your dream will protect you, because every time you start to do something that goes against your dream, it's gonna rise up and say, nah, I'm not gonna go hit a lick.
It'll protect you, I think, in a positive or in a negative way, right? It can also lock you into a story that...
It could.
So there's a concept that you've talked about that maybe can help people break out of whether it's the decision wheel or otherwise, but this concept of the go quotient, right? Oh. So in order for you to really move forward, success isn't just determined by your IQ or your EQ, your emotional quotient. Yeah. What is GQ? What's the go quotient?
The go quotient came about, I came up with the leadership survey, and I think SJ's taken. I sent it to him. Did you ever take that leadership? I think I'll have to go back. I digress a little bit. But I studied all these different people from all these different fields, had 13 questions. And those 13 questions, I had them answer. And most of the people, because I had known them and they've been important to me, all got 11 or higher. And I started to develop this idea, okay, where are these people at? And where are they at now? And they were all like overcomers and extraordinary people and had great stories. And one of the questions that I had asked them, and you can answer, right? When you look at fears or concerns, so I'm gonna put you on the spot here a little bit, and then we'll get back to the go quotient. Is your greatest concern, is it a concern about the unknown? Is it a concern about failure? Or is it a concern about a missed opportunity when you look at things?
Oh, so you're trying to hit me where my home is at. That's what we're doing.
I'm gonna hit you right here. I'm giving you a little bit of the go coach.
Oh goodness.
So if you look at those three, when you're factoring to do something or not to do something, you know, people have, and I don't like to use the word fear because people talk about fear of failure, but I say concern, you know. Are you more concerned about failure, a missed opportunity, or the unknown? What tends to dominate your thought process when you have to pull the trigger on something?
I think it's a combination of the first and the last, right? Because I think that failure can preclude you from an opportunity that you otherwise would have had. And so almost the marriage between those two, with probably the failure being the primary one. And I wouldn't say that it's something that really dominates my headspace. Like over time, I've been able to sort of calibrate around that. But if I had to pick a three, I know that that one's probably.
But you said that combination could kill a future opportunity. Did I read that right? What you were saying, the concern about the failure, right? And
a failure might preclude me from an opportunity that life could have gone in this direction, right?
So then basically with what you're telling me, what really dominates is securing an opportunity for the future, not killing that.
Sure.
So if I'm weighing this out, you're basically saying number two, you want to make sure you ensure future opportunity. That's what most people who have a high GQ would say, goal quotient. They would say,
a pass.
Fear of a missed opportunity. So I had questions like that, and we started to go through that. And so the goal quotient has these three components. The first thing is you have to be open, you have to be receptive. Some people are just closed off, and because they're closed off, they don't have opportunities. The next thing is guts. You have to have the courage to actually act on. You have to have what I call a high risk tolerance. Lots of people don't. You know, we live in a world, and then I'll break this down a little bit. You know, most of the stuff I do is low risk, high reward stuff, like education, you know, working out, saving money, investing wisely. Those are low risk, high rewards. But you also have to be able to do some high risk, high reward things also, you know, like starting your own business, you know, moving out to new partnerships when you don't know how it's going to work out. You know, relationships are as risky as anything. And so the first part of that is, you know, you got to be open and receptive. The second part is you must actually have the guts and the courage to step out and start to do it. The last thing where most people miss it, there's a word called voracious, not voracious like hungry and appetite, but voracious.
Like veracity.
Or veracity. And you have to be able to adjust to facts and truth as they present themselves. And most people get dogmatic about the way they've always done things, so they can't go. The journey comes to an end. So if you're not open, the journey comes to an end. If you don't have the courage, the journey comes to an end. If you're not voracious or you don't have the veracity, the journey comes to an end. And that's what the goal quotient is. And I've seen people, high IQ, low IQ, street survivors, corporate leaders, people who have a high degree of that are changers, they're catalysts. And, you know, and I look at catalysts as people that I want to partner with and be around. And they're rare.
Yeah, but man, if it's not inspiring to be around them, and can tell just by some of the spaces that you've occupied and some of the things that you've done that you've probably got a pretty strong GQ yourself.
Well, you know, the thing is, you know, when I said earlier about the 4 C's, right? You know, that's kind of my rubric: character, competence, critical thinking equals credibility. So people have those 3 of the people I surround myself with, but you also end up battling people who have high goal quotients but are not necessarily aligned with public good and community.
Ooh, man. Yeah. And goodness, almost like the 2 warring factions, right? Their meaning might be dialed in that they're doing the right thing, and it may be diametrically opposed to yours. So I think one of the last questions that I'll have for you, Hakim, before we wrap up, right, is that sense of meaning and narrative paired with the literal life that you're living end up creating almost a sense of biography of what our lives mean to one another. And so just as we've talked about some of these concepts, I'm real curious, for someone that's operating at a high level, both conceptually and literally around these topics, What sense of biography do you have for yourself? I know the story hasn't been completely written yet, but what does the good life for Hakim look like?
The good life for me, I think, people sometimes talk about self-actualization, all that stuff. I feel like I've achieved things in different fields. I remember in 2011, and I'm not a pastor, but I wrote something I thought was very inspiring, and it was, the diminishing value of community. And it actually got published in the Christian Post, which was the biggest Christian newspaper in the world. And that kind of surprised me, shocked me, because I am a writer. I've published articles, books, and things like that. I feel like it's, my story is meant to inspire other people to maybe go and journey into fields or places that maybe they wouldn't think about before. I think that a lot of folks, are still stuck in that decision wheel, right? Environment, experiences, expectations. I think that, the calling on my life is to help people envision and see what's possible. And then I contribute to that either, through what I do professionally or what I do volunteer-wise, because I do a lot on that both. And so my story at this point, when I look at achievements and accomplishments that I've had, I won't say that I'm satisfied with that, but there are a lot more than what I thought I would have at this juncture of my life. And I think now inspiring and helping other people create their platforms and live out their story, because I'm in the fall of my years, I'm pretty, transparent about that. But I think my biography will be, if someone was to look at my epitaph, that I helped a lot of people achieve what they had in their hearts. And I actually helped them figure out how to navigate that. And so that's why I've always been involved in mentoring, because I think it's so important. You learn from your experiences and then you try and help other folks. So that's kind of what, I want my biography to be. I got an opportunity to honor my father in June and look at his legacy. So I think it's important to build your legacy, and hopefully it's inspiring enough that people will connect with it, and then they'll go out and build theirs.
No, I hear that. Well, that's a wonderful and meaningful path to be on. I'm glad that you're on it. Hakim Hazim of Relevant Now, the original Big Zim. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Connor.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you found today's episode informative and inspiring. If you liked what you heard and you want to hear more, be sure to subscribe to Pathways and Means wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to learn more about CPM and how to grow creatively into the future, visit creativepathwaysandmeans.com, or you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok, where we post daily content and connect and engage with creators like you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.